One man burned his own flesh shut with a rifle barrel. Another walked naked for miles, half mad, after being stripped and left for dead. A third carved off a man's leg and ate it. All of it's real. But how come you haven't heard their names? And how close to death do you have to get before you stop being human? Today, we're sharing the wildest accounts of men who faced starvation, war, frostbite, cannibalism, and madness, and kept going. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Our countdown today starts with a storm, a buffalo hide, and one dying friend. Number 5, James Clyman. James Clyman knew the hard side of the wild. He'd already run with General Ashley's Fur Brigade back in 1823. Crossed paths with Jim Bridger, rode with Jedediah Smith, so he wasn't new to danger. But the winter of 1824, deep in Wyoming's Wind River Range, pushed him to the edge. He and William Sublette had left a Crow village on a hunting run in late winter. There wasn't much game left. But the camp was hungry, and they needed meat. At some point, they got lucky and dropped a buffalo. But luck ended there. A blizzard hit fast without warning. It was brutally cold. Whiteness swallowed everything. They were stuck in the open without shelter. All they had was their rifles, some buffalo meat, and a few hides. The wind tore through them. Snow blasted their faces. Their clothes got wet fast, and that cold went straight to the bone. Their horses stumbled through deep drifts. Their hands stopped working. Clyman wrote about it later. Said when they tried to start a fire, they couldn't even hold the flint. Their fingers were too numb. No grip, nothing. They even tried shooting sparks from their rifles into dry grass as a desperate move, but it didn't work. The wind was too much. To make matters worse, night was closing in. It was still snowing, still freezing. They knew if they didn't find heat soon, that was it. They dropped down behind a little patch of sagebrush. It wasn't much, but it cut the wind a bit. So Clyman started digging, just clawing at the snow, trying to find anything. And somehow, under the ashes of an old campfire, maybe left by a crow hunter, he found it. A coal, barely glowing. He cupped it in his hands, protected it with his body. He let it breathe. And, bit by bit, the ember caught. First the sage, then a little more. Then, real fire. And what did you know? That fire probably saved their lives. Then finally, warmth. It was just a tiny flash at first, but it was enough. Clyman didn't waste a second. He scrambled to gather more wood. Sublette, however, couldn't move by then. He could barely stay upright. He collapsed in the snow. Clyman dragged him closer to the fire. He peeled the steaming hide off the buffalo they'd shot. He wrapped Sublette in it, tight. Then, once the flames held, he roasted some meat and forced Sublette to eat a few pieces. Bit by bit, the warmth came back. Sublette's eyes started to focus again. His body stopped shaking. Clyman thawed his own hands by the small blaze. Still, they weren't safe, but they had a shot now. The storm kept going all that night and through the next day. The wind wouldn't stop howling. The snow kept coming. They stayed awake in shifts, taking turns feeding the fire. Neither dared sleep too long. They knew what happened to men who slept in that kind of cold. Then, when it finally let up, they were frostbitten, worn out. But they were still breathing. That ember Clyman found, that hide, that's what saved them. Without it, they'd be frozen out there, just 2 more names lost in the snow. In the end, they limped back to the Crow camp, starving, half dead, but carrying the meat they'd risked everything to get. And a story most wouldn't believe if he hadn't written it down himself. A lot of mountain men didn't make it through storms like that. But Clyman and Sublette did. Barely. That's how thin the line was out there. And while some men beat the cold, others had to beat death itself. The next mountain man on our list saved his by cutting off his own leg. Number 4. Thomas Pegleg Smith. In the fall of 1827, deep in the Colorado Rockies, Tom Smith was in trouble. He'd come out from Kentucky. Tough man, not soft in any way. He was trapping beaver with a brigade in the San Juan Mountains when things went bad. Then a fight broke out with a group of natives. Smith got hit, musket ball, or maybe an arrow, right in the lower leg. It didn't heal. It just got worse. It swelled up, turned black, and started to stink. He was rotting while still breathing. They were in North Park, what's now northern Colorado. There were no doctors or towns nearby, just mountains and snow and silence. Smith knew he wouldn't make it out if he didn't act. Infection was spreading fast, so he made the call. He'd cut the leg off. Milton Sublette was with him. He was another mountain man, brother of the same William Sublette that we talked about earlier. Milton helped him get ready. But in the meantime, they had no medicine, no clean tools. Smith swigged back some Taos Lightning. That's frontier whiskey, the kind that burns going down, and that was all they had for pain. Then he pulled his knife and started cutting. Through the skin, through the meat, just above the rot. He kept going until he couldn't. He gave the knife to Sublette, told him to finish it. Sublette didn't argue, didn't run. He took out a butcher's saw from their gear and went through the bone. And when the leg was off, they had to stop the bleeding without surgeon tools or clamps. So they heated a rifle barrel in the fire until it glowed, then pressed it to the stump. In an instant, the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Smith didn't scream. Maybe he was in shock. Maybe he just refused to. But somehow he survived. They then wrapped the stump best they could. That winter, he stayed with a band of Ute. While his body healed, he didn't sit idle. He fashioned himself a wooden leg out of oak and shaped it to fit the stump. He then tied it on and kept moving. That peg leg earned him his new name, Pegleg Smith. Nevertheless, losing a leg didn't slow him much. By spring, he was up and riding again. Walking, too. Still mean, still sharp. He even figured out how to yank off the wooden leg quick and use it as a club. Folks said he was the toughest barroom fighter west of the Mississippi. After that, he went right back to it, trapping, trading, living rough. His story spread fast. Around campfires, men would tell how Pegleg cut his own leg off in the middle of nowhere and lived. However, later he drifted into horse thieving and guiding, made a name in other ways. But it was that day in the Rockies that marked him. He left part of himself up there in those mountains, and what he got back was legend. And all the bad we've seen so far, there's bad. And then there's stripped naked alone in the wild bad. And that's exactly the kind of bad we're talking about with this next mountain man. Number 3, John Day. Now, not every nightmare out here came from the land. Sometimes it was people. John Day wasn't famous for a long career or some big victory. What made his name stick was one brutal moment when he lost everything and had to survive with nothing. It was 1811. John Day was older by then, a seasoned trapper from Virginia. He'd signed on with John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company, joining a crew led by Wilson Price Hunt. They were heading west, trying to open up a new post at the mouth of the Columbia River, what would become Fort Astoria in present-day Oregon. By early 1812, they'd already made it through a rough winter in the Rockies. Now they were traveling down the Snake and Columbia Rivers. And that's when things went sideways. Near where a river, later named after John Day, joins the Columbia, he and another man, Ramsey Crooks, ran into a group of Native Americans. Maybe Chinukans, maybe Cascades. No one's sure what started it. But the meeting turned bad, fast. They got stripped, not just robbed, stripped bare. Horses, rifles, gear, clothes, gone. The two men were left naked, alone, and unarmed in the cold, wet wild. Now, stop and think about that. You had no shelter, no fire, no food, no knife, not even a thread to cover your skin, just river fog and forest and the long stretch of land between you and the coast. It was early spring, still cold enough to kill. To make matters worse, at night the predators came out, wolves, big cats, and every step hurt. But John Day didn't quit. Neither did Crooks. They started walking. They had no maps and no boots. Iron will was the only thing that pushed them forward. They tried to cover themselves with bark and grass. They ate whatever they could find, roots, berries, anything. It took days, miserable days. Then they caught a break. A band of native people, likely Walla Walla or another group, found them. They saw what shape they were in and took pity. They gave them food, they gave them something to wear, animal hides, maybe a blanket. Afterward, the two men kept moving. And by the time John Day reached Fort Astoria in April 1812, he was alive, but just barely. He was starved, exhausted, and half mad. One historian later said it straight. The fact that he made it at all after being stripped and left out there with nothing was almost unbelievable. But the damage had been done. John Day rested at the fort. He got food, sleep, shelter. But something in him had changed. You could see it. He was quiet, distant. Today, we'd probably say he had PTSD. But back then, they just said he wasn't the same. That summer, however, Astor's men decided to send a group back east. John Day signed on. But while heading back up the Columbia, he broke down. Not physically, mentally. He snapped. The journals from that time said he went violently insane. He was ranting, out of control, couldn't keep going. The others had to leave him behind. They found a friendly native group near where the Yakima meets the Columbia and left John Day in their care. They promised to come back for him, but they never did. John Day stayed in the wild after that. He lived the rest of his life out in eastern Oregon. He died sometime around 1819, not far from the river that now carries his name. His story's mostly forgotten. You hear more about guys like Hugh Glass or John Coulter. But what happened to John Day, being robbed, stripped naked, left for dead, and still surviving, says just as much about what those early trappers went through. You see, that kind of toughness doesn't come loud. It comes slow and quiet, one step after another. The frontier broke plenty of men. It almost broke John Day too, but somehow he hung on. And while John Day's battle was in his head, this next mountain man on our list faced one of pure endurance. Number 2, Ezekiel Williams. Ezekiel Williams was tough and stubborn in a way only survival can teach. Born around 1775, he'd already seen years of hard country before this story even began. By 1807, he was an old hand on the upper Missouri, running with Manuel Lisa's Missouri Fur Company. He knew the land. He knew how to trap, how to hunt, how to stay alive when nobody was coming to help. In 1809, he led a small group of American hunters into the Central Rockies. What started as a trapping trip turned into a long, brutal fight to stay alive. They split off from Lisa's fort and headed south, chasing beaver into what we now call Colorado. It was country no one had mapped. And by spring of 1812, the cracks had widened. Tribes struck them over and over, stealing their traps, their horses, even killing men in ambushes. It wore them down, one hit after another. Eventually, Williams and 5 others got cornered by Arapaho near the headwaters of the Arkansas River. They couldn't run. Outnumbered, low on food, they tried something desperate. They asked for peace. And in a strange turn, the Arapaho chief said yes. He let them come into the village. These were the same people who had killed their friends. That winter, however, was long and bitter. Williams later said it was filled with dread. They were stranded, surrounded, and always wondering if the kindness would end. One wrong move, and they were dead. By early spring of 1813, Williams had had enough. He decided to leave, even if it meant dying out there. The other two men with him, Chaplin, a trader, and Partot, a French trapper, wouldn't go. The Arapaho had told them they'd be killed if they tried, but Chaplin and Partot still helped. Quietly, they carved out a dugout canoe from cottonwood and packed up the beaver pelts they'd stashed. Then came March 1st, 1813. Williams shook Chaplin's hand. Partot couldn't even speak. He simply turned away and cried. He didn't think he'd ever see Williams again. That morning, Williams slid the canoe into the cold, fast water of the upper Arkansas. Alone, a man with a rifle, a load of furs, and no backup. Just river ahead and hundreds of miles between him and any kind of safety. The image sticks. One man paddling east through wild country, knowing the river could kill him, or the tribes, or the cold. But he was going anyway. He made it, slowly. He rode the spring runoff, shot beavers when he could, roasted them over campfires, and packed the skins. And when the river dropped, he dragged the canoe by hand. Then, when the snow melt came in June, he floated again, almost 400 miles, alone the whole time. For a while, it looked like Williams might actually make it. He was beat up, half-starved, but still going. Then, on June 23, 1813, almost to the Great Plains, he ran into more trouble. A Kansa war party spotted him near what's now Kansas. One man in a dugout loaded down with furs? They didn't wait. They caught him, tied him up tight, and took everything, every pelt he'd dragged across half the continent. They dragged him back to their village. He knew what that could mean. Torture, death. The Kansa weren't friendly to American trappers, and they ran with other tribes who hated outsiders even more. For 7 weeks, Williams sat in their village, under guard. There was no way out. There was nothing to do but watch as they passed around the furs he'd risked everything to get. 2 years of hard work handed out like spoils. He was close to home now, but it must have felt farther than ever. But once again, he didn't die. Maybe it was luck. Maybe the Kansa saw something in him. He was older, worn down, but still standing. A survivor. For whatever reason, they let him go. And so, in mid-August, they cut him loose. They gave him back part of his furs, even handed him his rifle. That part of the story almost sounds made up, but it actually happened. And on August 15th, he walked out of the village, thin, weak, but alive. He headed east on foot and made it to Fort Osage, Missouri by early September. He'd been gone 2 years. George Sibley, the U.S. Indian agent there, heard his story and pushed the Kansa to return what they'd stolen. Some months later, they did. Meanwhile, Williams was done. He'd made it out. He survived Arapaho attacks, a frozen winter stuck with people who might have killed him, a 400-mile river run alone, and then 7 weeks tied up in a Kansa village. And he still walked out with some furs and his rifle. Later, his story made it into a book called The Lost Trappers. It got twisted, exaggerated, like a lot of frontier tales. But Sibley confirmed the basics. After all, Williams didn't need any dressing up. What he lived through was enough. Not long after, he went back to try and recover the furs he'd buried. That's when he found out the truth. Chaplin and Partot had tried to escape the Arapaho after he left. However, just like Lisa had warned, they didn't make it. In fur trade history, they call it the Adventures of Ezekiel Williams, but that makes it sound too clean. This was survival, day after day, through unimaginable cold, hunger, and isolation. Always watching your back. He didn't come out of it untouched, but he came out of it. But unlike the other mountain men who fought to live, our countdown ends with a tough mountain man who lived to kill. Number 1. John Liver-Eating Johnson. Johnson may not have been born a tough man, but he became one. He showed up in the Rockies sometime in the 1840s. He trapped, hunted, guided, did the work you had to do to live out there. Then, in 1847, the story turns. His wife, a Flathead woman, was pregnant. She was everything to him. While he was gone, a group of Crow warriors came. They killed her, left her body at the door of their cabin. And that broke something in him. He didn't grieve. Instead, he hunted. Without any war party or backup, he went after the Crow, one by one, over years. Some say it lasted 25 years. And there's this detail people won't forget. He was said to cut out the liver of each man he killed. Take a bite. Maybe that part's not true. Doesn't really matter. The Crow believed it. That fear was real. Bodies eventually turned up in the brush, scalped, always the liver missing. Same pattern, same message. Someone was out there, and he wanted them to know it was him. They started calling him the Crow Killer. Then came the other name, Liver-Eating Johnson, and this one stuck. By the 1850s, it was said no Crow warrior who crossed his path lived to tell about it. But even Johnson wasn't untouchable. In the late 1850s, he was crossing the Bitterroots. It was a 500-mile trip. He was alone, on foot, traveling to trade whiskey with his Flathead in-laws. On the way, Blackfoot warriors spotted him. They immediately knew who he was. They knew the Crow had a price on him. They hit him hard and fast. He couldn't resist, so they managed to take him down. They tied him up tight with leather thongs, wrapping him head to toe. They then tossed him in a teepee under guard. He was supposed to be a gift, a trophy. But Johnson wasn't built to die tied up like an animal. So, during his captivity, there was one young Blackfoot outside the lodge, guarding him. Without panicking or wasting energy, Johnson simply started working the leather quietly, bit by bit. He used his teeth and rubbed the straps until they gave. And when they did, he exploded out of the teepee like a storm. Johnson launched forward and drove his boot straight into the Blackfoot guard's face. All that rage, all that pain, it came out in that moment as though he was an enraged grizzly. He knocked the kid cold, but then it got worse. Johnson grabbed the man's knife. And then he did what most wouldn't even imagine. He cut off the guard's leg right at the hip, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer survival. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, with no food or weapon. That leg gave him both. He took the knife, and he took the leg. Then he moved. He fought his way through the camp swinging that bloody limb like a club. Anyone who tried to stop him, he put down hard. Cracked skulls, cut throats. Johnson left chaos behind. Later, under cover of dark and snow, Johnson disappeared into the trees. The Blackfoot didn't chase long. Some said they thought he was something more than human. Maybe they were right. Johnson hiked 200 miles through snow and ice, carrying that severed leg the whole way. He had no supplies on him. To survive, he sliced off strips of that Blackfoot guard's flesh as he walked. He ate it cold and kept moving. And by the time he made it to Delgue's cabin, he was half frozen, rail thin, and nearly dead, but alive. That escape spread fast across the frontiers. They called it Johnson's Running, like Coulter's Run years before. Some claimed later he faked the cannibalism just to shake his pursuers. Others said the story got tangled up with Boone Helm. But Johnson never denied it. And maybe that silence said everything. Because after that, even his enemies hesitated. Who wants to face a man who'll eat you to stay alive? And as the years passed, the blood kept spilling. But somewhere in the early 1870s, Johnson stopped. He made peace with the Crow. After all that killing, they sat down and talked. He finally buried it. He called them his brothers after that. Never touched another Crow again. Since then, the frontier kept changing. By the 1880s, Johnson wasn't out hunting men anymore. He was working as a Union scout, then a deputy sheriff in Montana. Time wore him down like it does everyone else. He died in 1900, not by blade or bullet or hunger, but in a veteran's home in California. A long way from the wild places that made him. People still argue about what parts of his story are true. What's myth? What's been exaggerated? Doesn't matter much. Enough of it happened to leave a scar on history. Aside from surviving the West, Johnson became part of what made it terrifying. And that's what stuck. The sheer will to live, no matter the cost. And in the end, all these tough mountain men that we spoke of, they survived because they had no other choice. After all, the mountains didn't care if you lived, and that's what made every step mean something.